It's a crossover edition as we get ready for game day. Iowa, Nebraska, Black Friday is here. I'm Trent Condon from Locked On Hawkeyes. He's Mitch Sherman from Locked On Nebraska and The Athletic. Mitch, good to see you. We have been talking on the radio for, I don't know, the better part of a decade, but
That's
I
right.
think this is the first time we've actually been looking at each other as we've been speaking. How you doing today?
Maybe once or twice in the Kinnick Stadium press box, we've looked at each other and said hello. But yeah, it's good to see you across the stream here, and hope you had a great Thanksgiving. And looking forward to Friday at Kinnick Stadium.
Well, we've been talking about this matchup throughout the course. I mean, it's a spring-summer matchup that we talk about a lot here in the state of Iowa. Black Friday, the conclusion of the season, and we've always been waiting for this game really to matter for both teams. And
Right.
we thought potentially Nebraska might be playing for bowl eligibility. That changes with the win last week against Wisconsin. So it's another season where there isn't anything hugely tangible on the line. However, there's a lot of people out there, and I want to get your perspective on this, that believe maybe they're playing for Tampa, that whoever wins this game is going to lock their ticket up to go to Tampa, the old Outback Bowl, now the ReliaQuest Bowl. And that is a great destination for a bowl game. Iowa's been there a ton. So that's at least something for these teams to play for outside of the trophy.
Yeah, I know Nebraska's not been to Tampa for a bowl game, familiar destination for the Hawkeyes, as you mentioned. Nebraska's been to Jacksonville, and of course, historically to Miami and other places in the state of Florida. Huskers have been to Orlando and a Citrus Bowl. Yeah, I think that the ReliaQuest Bowl was in Lincoln, had a rep in Lincoln last week for the Nebraska-Wisconsin game, if that means anything. And I think with the seventh victory, Nebraska would kind of move into that into consideration. Generally, it takes an 8 or 9 win team for that New Year's Eve window, but with Nebraska's bowl drought, it's been a shocking 8 years since Nebraska last appeared in a bowl game, 2016 in the Music City Bowl. So there's some interest, some elevated interest, some excitement for sure from Nebraska fans about going to a bowl destination, no matter where that might be. If it's Nashville again, if it's Phoenix for the Rate Bowl, that's been mentioned as a possibility. And then, yes, with a victory against Iowa, Nebraska would enter contention for Tampa and the ReliaQuest Bowl. So it's all out there. I think it's definitely refreshing for Nebraska fans to be able to have that conversation right now before Black Friday or on Black Friday, as opposed to all of the mud that Nebraska's been dragged through in the last decade. So while it may not have the meaning that you mentioned, like no division championship on the line, no bowl eligibility, nobody's playing for a CFP spot, Nebraska will gladly take that in a trade-off for knowing that it's going to be playing in December or January.
Yeah, different feel for this one, and certainly a lot of disappointment over here on this side of the river. The way the Iowa season has gone, 7-4 going into the finale here again on Black Friday against Nebraska. You guys punch your ticket in. You're into bowl season, and that's something you mentioned, the drought that has been there. What was it like throughout the course of this week? A short week, obviously, have the Black Friday game, but also just getting that bowl eligibility. One of the huge kind of, ammunition that Hawkeye fans certainly use on social media against Nebraska fans. And, if you're working in the office and you got a Husker fan there, you've been able to throw your quips. What's it been like? Finally, at least getting that first step, that first breakthrough here for this program under Matt Rule.
Yeah, it's definitely been one of the talking points this week and coming out of last Saturday at Memorial Stadium against Wisconsin. Of course, it was a celebratory atmosphere, and it didn't go down to the final seconds like many of the Wisconsin games, like many of the Iowa games have gone in the last few years. Nebraska was able to get some separation and win by 3 scores. So when the game was in the final minutes and it was in hand, party atmosphere, a lot of trolling of the Badgers going on inside the Nebraska Stadium, which on the scoreboard and such, they played the House of Pain jump around, which is just a completely new vibe, a totally new experience for Nebraska fans to not only beat Wisconsin, it's been since 2012, but to be able to rub it in the Badgers' face a little bit. They're more accustomed to being on the other side of that, and they've experienced that from Iowa, whether it's Keith Duncan blowing kisses to the Nebraska fans after the 2015 field goal to win the game, or last year. And Matt Rule brought this up. I had forgotten about it, but Matt Rule brought up in his Monday media availability this week, the Iowa players waving and saying Merry Christmas to the Nebraska fans and players as they left the field with a victory that, of course, kept Nebraska out of a bowl game last year. And that was another walk-off field goal, just a wild finish in Lincoln last year, where Nebraska seemed to have at least overtime secured, but through an interception, and then Iowa with the backup kicker was able to win it. So this week Trent has been different than the normal like Thanksgiving week, and the whole month of November has been colored by this Dana Holgorsen situation with the the Iowan, Mount Pleasant, Iowa. Grew up a Hayden Fry Hawkeyes fan, and of course former 13-year coach in the Big 12, is Nebraska's offensive coordinator in his third game. Just came in out of nowhere in the middle of late in the season during a bye week. Here you go. Here's a new offensive coordinator. Doesn't know your system, doesn't know your plays, but he's going to be calling everything for the rest of the way. And in game 2 under Holgorsen, it went very well. 44 points was a high in the Matt Rule era for the Huskers.
Today's episode of Locked On Nebraska and Locked On Hawkeyes is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code Locked On College for $20 off your first purchase. Mitch Sherman from the Locked On Nebraska perspective. I'm Trent Condon on Locked On Hawkeyes. Give you an overview here, and then we'll get kind of a season-long overview from the Nebraska side. This has been a hugely disappointing year for Iowa. Comes into the year, 19 returning starters from a year ago. And though I don't think there was many Hawkeye fans that believed they were going to go into the shoe and beat Ohio State, they knew there were going to be other difficult games. You look at the crossovers, you look at kind of the way the schedule played out. The hope was this is going to be a team that maybe came into this one with a chance at the college football playoff, that had an opportunity to play for that, maybe a 10-2 type of season, and you can get there. And I think a 10-2 season probably would have got them there if it would have played out in that fashion. It didn't. And it wasn't just bad quarterback play, as we've seen so much. There's been a whole lot more there, even as Caleb Johnson has had one of the most incredible years in Iowa football history at the running back spot. It's been inconsistency again at the quarterback spot, but maybe more surprisingly, this team that returned 9 starters on the defensive side of the football, they've struggled. They've struggled mightily on that side, and it's been different aspects of it. A couple weeks ago against UCLA, I know you guys remember UCLA well, as also from a surprising loss earlier this year. Team that couldn't run the football, and they ran the football against Iowa. They've struggled to find a second cornerback. Their top cornerback is out for the rest of the season now. Jamari Harris will not play against Nebraska on Friday. So a lot of components here. It's just been a surprising year and a greatly disappointing year, because this was the season where it felt like it was all in place, schedule, returning talent, all those different things. It didn't happen. And then a lot of speculation about the future of what Kirk Ferentz is going to be. And as he's approaching 70 years old, what that's going to mean for this program going forward. And you look at next year's schedule, it is an absolute bear. So a lot of disappointment over here on the east side of the Missouri River. Let's go to the west side of the Missouri River. What has been just a solid overview of the Nebraska season?
Yeah, I'll say this first of all. It's intriguing to watch what's going on in Iowa City this year. You know, from my perspective as somebody who's been around the Iowa program and has covered the Iowa program before, I go into this with I'll get to your question about Nebraska in a second, but I go into this with obviously that question about Ferentz, and is there going to be some clarity? Is there going to be an answer here? It would seem just wild to think that this could be the last time that we see him on the sideline at Kinnick. But as you said, when you get to that place in his career that he's at, you just never know. So that to me is a huge storyline, although probably one that's a little under the radar, because you just, expect, well, he's going to be back. He's always going to be back. He always comes back. That I think is a storyline that people aren't necessarily talking about. In that quarterback situation, I wonder, maybe we can get to this after I talk about Nebraska, but does Iowa even attempt to throw the ball more than just like a token pass here or there? It's amazing to me to look at what's happened since Cade McNamara went down, and to see that in the games that Iowa's won, it's thrown for under 100 yards. And the one time where it did air it out just a bit with Sullivan against UCLA, that's the loss. That's the one loss that's on the schedule in the last month. So I wonder, going into this game where it's going to be cold and, difficult to catch the ball, do they even attempt to throw it? Like Nebraska's had its share of defensive mistakes this year too, and struggling with various parts of, whether it was UCLA and struggling with the run game, or Wisconsin, got it going through the air. Like, this hasn't been a great second season for Tony White, Nebraska's defensive coordinator, especially following up what the Huskers did on defense and being a top 10, top 15 defense last year, despite the 5-7 season. So some disappointment there for sure from Nebraska to get into talking about this season for the Huskers. Not as good defensively as I think people expected coming into the year. Offensively, it's been a mixed bag. You've got the freshman quarterback, Dylan Raiola, the former 5-star Georgia, Ohio State commit who flipped to Nebraska a year ago this time and won the starting job, and really won it in the spring, but they waited until August to announce that. It was inevitable, and he got off to a great start. Nebraska was 5-1. Had that win over Colorado where the Huskers looked like a top 20 team, and jumping out to a 28-zip halftime lead, putting that game out of reach in the second quarter, and going to Indiana after 6 games. This was a team I think that people weren't worried about bowl eligibility. It was like, hey, could they be a 9-win team? Like, Ohio State loomed out there as an expected loss, but everything else looked winnable. And they went on a 4-game skid, 56-7 at Indiana, just a disaster. Like, in every way, shape, and phase, that game was a huge setback, not just for this team, but for the progress that Matt Rule's making in his second year of getting people to believe and buy into what he wants this program to be. And then you rebound and you go to Ohio State and just about pull it out 21-17. Like, Nebraska had a chance to win that game in the final minutes. And, people think, all right, it was an anomaly. One game at Indiana, like, we can forgive if that's going to be, the only time the team looks like that all year. Bye week going into UCLA, Nebraska's expected to get bowl eligible against UCLA, and nope, Bruins just take it to Nebraska. And it was a physical, whooping, and then a loss to USC. So the Holgorsen stuff creeps in as a big storyline. Dylan Raiola really regressed for parts of the season. He dealt with injuries. Teams figured out how to pressure him and really rattle the true freshman at times. Nebraska's running game was not consistent, and then you have the Wisconsin game where the offense just got it together and played a solid game. And I think some of that Holgorsen stuff has really taken the middle of the stage as being a huge storyline right now. Like, he finally got Nebraska to play the kind of offensive football that we hadn't seen since the month of September. So a lot of ups and downs. I wouldn't say like tremendous deep disappointment, the same kind of disappointment that maybe Iowa feels being in 7-4, 6-5 at Nebraska actually feels okay by and large, because it's been since 2016. Yeah, I mean, if some things are a little bit different, maybe if Dana had said yes to this job when Matt Rule first approached him last offseason, this could have been an 8 or 9 win team.
Let's get into the matchup. We're going to talk about that. Mitch Sherman, Locked On Nebraska. Myself, Trent Condon, Locked On Hawkeyes. A crossover edition. What we're going to see on the field Friday night against the Nebraska Cornhuskers for the Iowa Hawkeyes. Kinnick Stadium, chilly, as Mitch mentioned. We'll talk about that as we continue here. A crossover edition. Locked On Nebraska and Locked On Hawkeyes. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time has a new feature called Game Time Picks. Makes getting tickets to see your favorite teams play live even easier. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of different tickets. I love the Game Time app. I love the ability to know exactly what my total is going to be up front. All-in pricing. Toggling this feature shows the total up front. No more surprise fees at checkout. A lot of times, maybe you're going to a new stadium. Maybe you're a Nebraska fan coming to Kinnick for the first time. You can get panoramic views from your seat in the app before you buy with the Game Time app. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time Picks. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCollege. LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time.
And I would like to tell you about Home Field. Home Field is an exclusive apparel provider of the Locked On Nebraska podcast. We love the gear at the Locked On Nebraska podcast. You'll love it too. What an exciting time here at the end of the college football season. The college football playoff and bowl season is coming up. And no matter what team you follow, you'll want to wear that team's gear. If it's Nebraska or any other team, we've got a Black Friday special to tell you about. Head to homefieldapparel.com. Use the code BF for Black Friday, CM24 for 30% off right now until Tuesday, December 3rd. Why should you do it? Because Home Field is here to make your experience more enjoyable. It is a premium collegiate apparel brand based in Indianapolis. They specialize in incredibly comfortable, officially licensed apparel with vintage designs. Home Field has curated items for fans to wear all season. Check out the fantastic football box, upgrade to the platinum VIP box. All of it is there at homefieldapparel.com. Remember, use the code BFCM24 for 30% off today through next Tuesday. That's homefieldapparel.com.
Trent Condon from Locked On Hawkeyes, Mitch Sherman from Locked On Nebraska back with you in a crossover edition. Well, we talked about the game. We heard about Home Field there. And yes, Hawkeye fans, I love their gear. They hooked me up with some gear a couple years back, and you absolutely nailed it on that one, Mitch. Love the stuff that they have there. Not just Nebraska fans, Hawkeye fans, you can get it as well. Let's jump into what we expect to see on Friday night. And this has been a rivalry that has turned the Hawkeyes' way. You know, if you would have told me back in 2011 when Nebraska joined the Big Ten that at any point Iowa win 9 out of 11 in this series, I would have called you absolutely crazy. Yet here we are. The only win over the last decade came 2 years ago for Nebraska in Kinnick Stadium in a game where Iowa turned it over 4 times, 3 lost fumbles, an interception. They're back and forth between Padilla and between Spencer Petras in that game at the quarterback spot. And when I look at it, you mentioned a little bit earlier, the quarterback spot for Iowa. And it's going to be, I think, compelling to see what they do. And it's going to start even before the game. What's going to happen with Cade McNamara? Because he is going to be honored. Talk about a guy that has gone through a rough patch, has not been with the team, started practicing last week. Then we had, what's exactly going on here? He doesn't travel to Maryland. Is it because of the concussion? Is it something else? Apparently he's back practicing this week. There has been a lot. And there's always something with Iowa football. There's always something going on. And certainly the quarterback spot for the last 6-7 years, it has just been incredibly difficult. So Jackson Stratton's going to get the start. And yes, the question, I was getting by. Well, they've done this a lot without throwing the football for less than 100 yards, and they continue to find ways to win games. One thing I'll tell you about Jackson Stratton, though, this kid started in August, walked on from, he was at Colorado State. Nobody wanted him. He was in the portal, didn't have any offers, went to one of those camps that they had for uncommitted prospects. And Tim Lester saw him, liked what he did. Dude's got a hose. I mean, he's kind of a skinny guy, tall, angular type of guy, but he has got an absolute rocket arm. I think the best arm talent that Iowa has. Now, it says something, too, that your 5th-team walk-on has the best arm talent in your room, too, but that's another conversation. But he can sling it. And against Maryland, they made it very simple. It was one read, but it wasn't across the middle. It wasn't simple dump-offs. It was using that big right arm and throwing it down the field, deep ins, deep outs, those kind of throws. So he's got arm talent. He just doesn't have a whole lot of experience. And against this Nebraska team, the way they're built up front, I think he's going to have to throw the football. And it doesn't have to be a ton, but he's going to have to make some throws, I believe, to beat Nebraska.
Yeah, there's an opportunity there for him to do it. And we saw it with Wisconsin and Braden Locke last week in Lincoln. And part of that was because Wisconsin played from behind the whole game, got down 34-10 early in the fourth quarter, tried to mount a comeback, hit a couple of big throws, but Nebraska was able to keep the distance in that game. And Huskers have been solid in the secondary for most of the year, but some struggles have occurred lately. And some of that involves like the on again, off again availability of Tommy Hill, who was the Huskers' best corner to enter this season. At some point was projected as a possible first-round NFL draft pick, was a starter, 4 interceptions all through last season, had the pick 6 against Shadur Sanders in the Colorado game. That was a highlight of the entire season. And then had a foot injury, and Tommy Hill just hasn't been himself. And before the Wisconsin game, Matt Rule came out and said, "Look, we're going to shut him down." I think some of that is because he just hasn't been able to be healthy, and then also because he's only hurting himself. Like at this point, he's hurting Nebraska, he's hurting himself, and doesn't want to put that necessarily on film of him being at 50% or 80% or whatever it is. So Nebraska's in a bind at one of the corner spots. Fortunately for the Huskers, Sierra Wright, the USC transfer who arrived in Lincoln just this summer, has emerged as Nebraska's best corner, arguably Nebraska's best defensive back, and the Huskers are strong at the safety positions with Deshaun Singleton and Isaac Gifford. But Sierra Wright has been the most consistent guy in coverage, had a pick 6 against USC, played well against Wisconsin and really all through the second half of the season when he got his opportunity after Tommy Hill was hurt. So Nebraska doesn't have a whole lot of options beyond him. Marquise Buford has played the corner spot. Malcolm Hartzog has played the corner spot. Those guys are more safeties. They're built more like safeties. And I think there's an opportunity there, much like what we saw against Wisconsin, if Stratton can get that arm going, for Iowa to hit some stuff over the top of this Nebraska defense. That's how Nebraska did it to Iowa 2 years ago at Kinnick. I remember that game as the Trey Palmer game.
Mhm.
You see him now in the NFL, and he was a 4-3 guy at the combine. Iowa didn't have, even with great defensive backs, didn't have anyone to go out and cover Trey Palmer on a deep route. It showed in that game, and it's why Nebraska won that game 2 years ago. So perhaps the tables are turned and Iowa can burn Nebraska deep if the Hawkeyes have a way to get beyond the Nebraska secondary with their receivers, and then Stratton can loft it up there. That would certainly be a big problem for Nebraska because the Huskers want to sell out defensively to stop Caleb Johnson, and if they've got to think about things on the other side, on the backside, then it puts a big stress on that defense.
It's going to be incredibly cold. Might be the coldest game in Kinnick Stadium history. The low is 19 degrees, I think, a game time temperature that we've seen before. So we know it's going to be chilly there. It's going to be a lot of ground and pound. The wind's going to die down, though. By the time we get into the evening at 6:30 kickoff, and we know that'll be about a 6:40 kickoff by the time we actually get there, the winds will have died down. There might be some flurries in the forecast, and I think who can make a play. So you mentioned Raiola, and we see the talent. I mean, there's no doubt about that. Kind of banged up, and this was always my question about him is what he was going to look like in November, playing in these kind of conditions for the first time, playing after being banged up throughout the course of a Big Ten season. What you think we're going to see from him on Friday night? One of the guys that Trey Palmer beat deep, TJ Hall, well, now he's back as a starter after playing as a freshman when Cooper DeJean left that game with an injury against Nebraska a couple of years ago. He played maybe his best game in a Hawkeye uniform last week against Maryland, against Ty Felton, who's one of the best wide receivers in the Big Ten. He played really, really well, had a interception in the game. What do you think from Raiola? What you see at this point, not what he's going to be, not just talent, but for this one game on Friday night, kind of where he is both mentally and physically.
Yeah, I think he's in a good place mentally. I wouldn't have said the same thing a week ago, but 28 for 38 for 297 yards or 93 yards against Wisconsin was a confidence booster for him. I think he's found a rhythm and some chemistry with Holgorsen as a play caller. Things just look different for Nebraska on offense in the last time out. It's one game, and I realized Iowa hung 40 on Wisconsin too, and this isn't the Badgers defense that maybe we've come to know over the past 10 years. But Nebraska needed something. It needed a shot in the arm because the talent is there, not just at the quarterback spot, but the talent's there at the receiver spot, at the tight end spot, at the running back position. Like that's not been the issue for Nebraska offensively this year. The issue's been organization. The issue's been like having focus. The issue's been keeping pressure away from Dylan Raiola. The offensive line has played probably its best 2 games of football if you listen to the assessment of the coaches in the last 2 weeks against USC and then Wisconsin. So where's Raiola? He hasn't played a cold November game yet. Nebraska's schedule in November put him at home on the 2nd against UCLA on a nice day in Lincoln. Then he was in LA. Obviously, it was nice out there on the 16th, and back home last Saturday on November 23rd wasn't anything that where weather was a factor at all. It was a much nicer afternoon than what we're going to see at Kinnick. I don't think he's the kind of guy who is going to really struggle in that way. He has kind of a lineman mentality about him. Of course, his dad, Dominic, was a longtime center in the NFL, played for the Detroit Lions. Dylan's uncle, Donovan Raiola, is the offensive line coach at Nebraska. Like those guys are not in any way built like physically or mentally. And this goes down to Dylan and his brother Dayton, who's a Nebraska quarterback commit in the 2026 class. They're not built in any way physically or mentally to like shy away from cold weather. Dylan kind of grew up in Detroit, despite the Hawaiian heritage, and just despite the Arizona and Georgia high school career that he had. He grew up in Detroit and he knows about the cold, so it's not going to surprise him. He was standing outside on the turf at Memorial Stadium this week on Monday and Tuesday nights watching the high school championships. It was cold those nights, so that's not a big concern for me. But it's going to be tough to catch the ball. And, he throws a hard ball, much like Stratton does. Receivers generally like that, but when it comes in like a cement block on Friday. We'll see. It's going to be a test mentally for Nebraska receivers to haul those passes in especially when they know that a hard-hitting Iowa defense is waiting on the other side to deliver more wood if the Huskers do come down with the catches. It's not going to be an easy night to throw the football.
Yeah, no doubt about it. We continue here on Locked On Crossover Edition, Locked On Nebraska and Locked On Hawkeyes. We'll make our final predictions, little basketball talk as well as a great start to the season with that win against Creighton for Nebraska last week. Hoops as the Big Ten play goes, and we'll make our predictions for the game. Iowa, Nebraska, it's a crossover. Stay right there as we continue. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Get ready to tackle NFL action with FanDuel. It's America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers, you can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. Iowa, currently a 5.5-point favorite on the FanDuel Sportsbook app, odds subject to change, and the over-under sitting at 39 on a chilly night at Kinnick Stadium. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet for new customers. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Trent and Mitch back with you one final time. Crossover edition, Locked On Hawkeyes and Locked On Nebraska as we count down to kickoff here Black Friday in Kinnick Stadium. Prediction time before that, let's talk a little hoops. Iowa took their first loss of the season last week against Utah State. I think there is a little bit of optimism that this team might be a little bit different. Some different Fran McCaffrey teams, a little more athleticism added in from the transfer portal. Two guys that were unheralded kind of portal guys, not like they went out and spent a bunch of money for them. They got Drew Thelwell, fifth-year guy from Morehead State, was a four-year starter point guard, 6'3" point guard, adds a different kind of dimension than what they've had. You know, you look back, Mike Cassell, Jordan Bohannon, kind of the same type of point guard, not elite athleticism. They get with that with Thelwell. And then Seydou Traore, who's been banged up through the course of the season. They got him from Manhattan. He's been really key in the top of the press, though. And this Iowa team's actually better defensively. I don't want to call them good because they're not there yet, but better on the defensive end of the floor. So that's the optimistic view from the Iowa perspective of maybe this team can do a little bit more than get to the tournament, maybe win a game, but that's it, as it's been a 25-year drought since the last time they made it to the Sweet 16. Nebraska, I know you guys are still searching for your first NCAA tournament win, but that win against Creighton, that had to be an eye-opener.
Right. You guys know Fred Hoiberg well, of course, in the state of Iowa, and people are happy. People are happy with Fred. I had a lot of questions coming into this season, watched the first few games in the non-conference action, and Nebraska didn't really inspire me with much of what it was doing. It's largely a new team. As you see in college basketball, the Huskers have Juwan Gary down low, Bryce Williams up top, who are back as core pieces. Sam Hoiberg, Fred's son, is a glue guy off the bench, but the rest is a bunch of transfers. Connor Sejan, the Wisconsin transfer that people around the Big Ten know is a shooter off the bench. Nebraska has Raleigh Worcester, a point guard from Utah State, who came in and has done a nice job running the point. Burke Buchtengel, transfer from across the Big Ten at UCLA, is a guy with some skills. Gavin Griffiths, another transfer who's been a bit banged up at the beginning of the season, but is a sharpshooter who can help Nebraska coming off the bench from Rutgers. Yet another Big Ten transfer, Braxton Mia, the big man from Washington, is in to help. And then Nebraska has Aaron Eulis, which is a name that is familiar with Iowa fans. The point guard formerly of Iowa sat out last year because of the gambling situation, but he's been cleared and has been playing in a reserve role for the Huskers too. So a lot of pieces that Fred is working in, and Nebraska had a huge victory in Omaha last Friday night, taking down Creighton in a game that the Huskers just dominated physically. Ryan Kalkbrenner, the All-American candidate for the Blue Jays, who scored 49 points in a game early this season, was 0 for 1 shooting in that game. His one field goal attempt was a missed three-pointer. Nebraska locked him down, double teams in the post, and it's an older team, So, yeah, sitting here going into December, we're going to find out. Nebraska's got Michigan State, Indiana early on the Big Ten slate this year. I think there's hope after that Creighton game that this can be a team that returns to the tournament. And after last year getting there and losing in the first round against Texas A&M, I don't know. I wouldn't have said it going into the season, but maybe there's an opportunity for this group to be the one that gets over the hump for Nebraska and gets this program its first NCAA tournament win. I'm at least a lot more interested now to see how it looks in December and January than I felt a week or two ago.
We'll get to see this game twice. This is the kind of the protected rivals that we'll see in early January. That'll be on Tuesday, January 7th. That one at Carver Hawkeye. And then the regular season finale on Sunday, March 9th. And might be a lot on the line there, and certainly have to anticipate there's going to be seeding implications for the Big Ten tournament in that one to wrap up the year. All right, let's wrap things up here, Mitch, with our thoughts on this football game. Your prediction for Friday night, Black Friday, Iowa, Nebraska, rivalry renewed in the Heroes game.
Yeah, well, I better stick to what I said Thursday on the Locked On Nebraska pod with my co-host Connor Happer. We go through our picks and yeah, 20-16, Iowa is my pick in this one. I don't think that Nebraska is going to be able to have the same array of success offensively that it did against Wisconsin last week. I think for Phil Parker and Iowa's defensive staff to have the opportunity to get another week of film to watch of what Dana Holgorsen is doing with this Nebraska offense is invaluable. Yeah, you've got a short week and less time to prepare, but I'm sure that video was much watched. So there were some different looks. Like Nebraska did some different things schematically with some mesh routes that we haven't seen much of didn't see much of for the first 9 or 10 games. Even in Holgersen's debut, that was really just like, let's get through this game and try to learn the terminology. I mean, he didn't know the players' names. He was calling guys by their jersey numbers in his first week on campus. So, but things turned against Wisconsin. Nebraska got comfortable. He got into a rhythm. I was going to take some of that away. I was going to make Dylan try to beat the Hawks over over that defense. Like I think the thing with Nebraska is you try to make them one-dimensional. You try to turn them into a team that has to run the ball because you've locked things down in the secondary, and that's where Nebraska has struggled this year. That's where the struggles came in against Illinois. Which was a loss on the Friday night in September against Rutgers, which Nebraska squeaked out a win. Indiana obviously did it. Was Ohio State, shut things down for some of that game against Nebraska enough to win. So to me, Iowa's defense is going to be up to the challenge. It's going to be a low scoring game. I like what Drew Stevens, brings for Iowa in the special teams area. That's an advantage, I think, for the Hawks, despite Nebraska having had a resurgence at its kicker position with John Hole, who has made 8 consecutive field goals after Nebraska went through the first half of the season without anything viable at the kicker position. So somewhat closer to being even ground there in special teams, but I think Iowa wins that aspect of the game and gets out with an 8th victory. 20-16 is my call for Friday night.
We are on very similar paths. I have Iowa getting it done in this one, not covering the spread, but getting the outright victory. I think it's going to be a tight one, likely going to come down to the end. And it's interesting. Drew Stevens has had a tremendous year, had 5 field goals last week against Maryland. He was the guy that was benched a year ago against Nebraska, and that's why we saw Marshall Meter, a guy I pride myself in knowing everybody. And here it comes trotting out onto the field. Who in God's name is this guy? And Marshall Meter hit the game winner barely over the crossbar, but got it over in the win there. Drew Stevens is kicking outstanding with confidence, and I think he wants a little redemption here. I got Iowa getting it done 23-20 and a walk-off. Drew Stevens comes down to a field goal again, and Iowa gets the victory.
Pain.
Yes, more pain. More pain, but hey, you're going bowling, and that's okay. And I don't think they're going to send you to Detroit or New York. So you're going to have something at least relatively warm weather for bowl season this year. Mitch, we are out of time. This has been a lot of fun. Really appreciate you. And maybe we'll do this again come basketball season when it's really here, when we flip the calendar to 2025. Enjoyed our conversation as always.
Yeah, I would love to do it again. Thanks for having me on, Trent.
Crossover edition. Thanks for making Locked On Hawkeyes and Locked On Nebraska your first listen every day. We got you covered on all fronts here across the Locked On network, including Craig Sheeman and Locked On Big Ten. Make sure to check that out on your podcast app. For Mitch Sherman, I'm Trent Condon. Thanks for being with us. Enjoy Black Friday and Iowa, Nebraska.